We forgot, but you. We wandered, but you. We failed, but you. The defining reality of the story is not about the inconsistency and the unfaithfulness of people. The defining reality of the story is about God's faithfulness, the unending faithfulness of God. So here we are. We find ourselves in a series on remembering, and we are approaching a text this morning out of the book of Nehemiah. So I invite you to open up your Bible to Nehemiah chapter 9, and we're going to look at the chapter in its entirety, but I'm not going to read through the entire chapter, and I want you to hold it before you because I will be referring to it throughout the message. There's one particular text, though, embedded in this broader prayer that is the hinge for the whole message this morning, and it comes from verse 38 at the end of this prayer, and it says this: in view of all of this, we are making a binding agreement. Now hold that as we move through different movements and move through one of the longest recorded prayers that we have in the biblical text. As I was reflecting on my own remembering and going back into bits and pieces of my own story, I recalled before I moved here to Los Angeles, just 8 months ago, I was living in Boulder, Colorado, just outside of Boulder. And Boulder is a beautiful place to be. And as I stood back and reflected on my commute in the morning, I lived 2 miles away from where I worked. And the backdrop of my commute was the Flatiron Mountains. So every morning I would wake up and be greeted by the Flatiron Mountains. And that does something to perspective. And it created this sense of slowness and pace and being able to just kind of take in the morning slowly as I moved into my day. And sometimes I would walk to work, sometimes I would bike to work, depending on the weather, and sometimes I would drive. But as I would walk and as I would ride my bike, we lived in an area where there was lots of open spaces. And so we would find ourselves walking through nature next to lakes and ponds and animal life. And there was such a different pace. And that was the backdrop that I walked into every morning. And now I find myself here back in Los Angeles. This is home. This is what I know. And I find myself on the 405 every morning, a completely different backdrop. And the backdrop that I see in the morning is usually a Honda Accord, or let's be honest, it's a Tesla, which seems like every other car in Los Angeles is a Tesla. And that's my viewpoint. And the pace of Los Angeles moves at an accelerated rate. And as I move through this accelerated rate, and I'm taking in all of this information on a constant basis every day, it feels like the messages that I was getting in Boulder based on the pace of life were maybe 10 different messages per minute. And now it feels like there's hundreds of different messages coming my way per minute. And I'm finding myself forgetting more so because of the competition of my attention. And that tendency to forget as humans is true of all of us, but as I forget, I'm realizing that I'm forgetting the story that I'm actually living in. And Nehemiah acts as an anchor point. It refocuses us and helps us to remember the bigger story that we're finding ourselves in. So Nehemiah, to give some context, the people of God had just finished rebuilding the walls that God had asked them to build. The project is done, and you would think, okay, now celebration can occur. We can celebrate this victory, but the people find themselves disoriented. They've spent so long under the shadow of empire and under the boot of Persia that they began forgetting about the actual story of God, and their identity was being shaped and formed by a different story. And when you step back and look at the text, you would assume rebuilt walls would assume a rebuilt people, but we're finding something completely different, that just rebuilding the walls didn't mean that the people themselves were experiencing a rebuilding inside of their own soul. And so they gather. They gather and they do some things intentionally that we're going to work through this morning. There's these different movements that I'm going to invite us to consider as a community as we move through these different kinds of movements to help us recenter ourselves in a better story. And there's an honest reckoning that happens inside of this prayer. Not just performance, not just pretending. They go into an honest reckoning, and they step fully into where they're situated in the story, And we see a healing process begin to happen where they begin to live into a broader, beautiful, more robust story that begins to help them reshape and reform their own identities as people. So we begin with the posture of the soul. And the posture of the soul is so important whenever we move into a story. And the text tells us at the beginning that they put on sackcloth and they cover themselves in dust. And notice what they're doing with their dusty fabrics. They're rehearsing the Torah, the law. They listen to the law for an entire day being read, and they're listening together. They fast, they confess, they're beginning to embody the bigger story. Now, we think of this, and we are so far removed from sackcloth and dust and these dusty fabrics, especially when the backdrop that we experience is an accelerated pace, looking at Teslas and Honda Accords as our backdrop. We don't wear sackcloth, but if we're honest, we wear curated identities. We wear anxiety, or we wear busyness and distraction. And we put on these busyness badges. You know, I think about conversations that we have in certain social circles, and one of the things that often comes up when you ask the question, how are you? Immediately there's a tendency to respond, oh my gosh, I'm so busy. I've been so busy. It's like we wear these busyness badges as these proud badges of honor to somehow convey that I have this level of importance because I wear this busyness badge. See how busy I am. So when I think about this sackcloth, what does it look like for us in 2026? And I don't think it's just an inward or an outward display of a dusty fabric. I think that what's going on here is an inward posture. And when we start to go inward and we look at what's happening internally in our stories, that's the moment that we begin to admit that we don't have it all together and there's certain things that we need to work on as a community. Or even deeper, it's finding the courage to take a deep dive and to admit that our comfort or our addiction to comfort might actually be attributing to our spiritual drowsiness. Or if we're honest and we go even deeper, we might find that that brave decision to stop numbing ourselves long enough so that we can stop having to pay holy attention. So it's getting deeper and deeper to the thing under the thing. And I want you to hear this, because what we give our attention to, what we fix our gaze on, has a way of shaping and forming us as human beings. And so we have to get in tune to what we're looking at, what we're gazing upon, what we're fixed upon, what we're giving our undivided attention to. This is actually the work that I have been privileged to do over the last 10 years of my journey through life. I've worked with systems and people, helping them move through identifying problems as a community. What kinds of things are we not aware of that we need to be aware of? I've done work with relationships and helping people move through conflict and to rebuild the loss of connection or a lack of communication, helping people feel okay or safe. And that's been a good work. And this is exactly what I see Nehemiah 9 doing, helping people work through things in places in which they are stuck, and anchoring ourselves in a prayer that can actually lead to transformation and liberation. So as we move through the movements of the prayer, the first move we get to is verses 6 through 25. And if you want to read through 6 through 25, I would call this the movement of rehearsing the whole way. So they're going back in their story, they're reaching back in order to remember forward. And as I said earlier, this is one of the longest recorded prayers that we have in the scripture. And it's a communal prayer, and it can feel like a dry history lesson, but as you move through the prayer, you see the dynamism of the prayer. They're rehearsing Abraham, Egypt, the Red Sea, the great and terrible wilderness, the cloud, the fire by night, all of these pictures of how God had faithfully helped them move and navigate through their entire story. So yes, it is a history lesson, but it's an act of remembering, going back into the broader story. And if you only read it as a history lesson, you're missing the actual thing under the thing that is the root of what we're anchoring in. This is about identity formation, group identity, remembering who we are. So the Levites, this priestly tribe of Israel, stand in their dusty fabrics, and they begin to recount the whole way that God has led them through these various points in history. And if we follow the pattern, the first thing they do in sections verse 6 through 25 is they begin to rehearse the character of God. And they say, God, you are the one who saw our affliction. God, you are the one who divided the sea. God, you are the one who led us through the wilderness. You are the one who did not abandon us. And you notice the pattern. You are the one. You are the one. You are the one. They're anchoring themselves in the character of God. And for decades, they had fixed their gaze on the fact that they had been captured by empire. And again, whatever holds our attention begins to shape our identity. So getting deeply embedded in the story of what is holding my gaze. And if you listen to the story that they're living in, and then reflect on your own life and our community, what story are we living in? What's the story that we keep telling ourselves? And are we aware of the stories that we're telling ourselves? It makes me think of a record. When you think of a record, and when a record is being cut, there's these little grooves inside of each record, and those grooves represent different tracks of the song. And then when you put the needle on the groove, it slides across the disc as you listen to each song, and you get to the next track, it stops and goes to the next. But what happens so often in stories is that a groove gets deeply affected, and we call that a skip in the record. And that skip, that groove goes down deeper, and sometimes that skip can be a traumatic event, it can be an experience, it can be a memory, it can be a moment that we give deep and significant meaning to. And then that groove goes in deep, and what happens over time is that as the groove deepens, the needle stays in that particular groove, and you start living in that continual story. And this is what's happening. The people are living in a story. And this is what happens in communities. We live in a story and we stay stuck in the groove without realizing that there's a bigger story that we're being invited into, and we stay in this groove, and it feels like this is all there is. And the invitation is, in this prayer, is to take that needle out of that deep groove and begin moving it up in the prayer. And they're lifting up the needle, putting it to the next track, remembering the whole story. God, you are a God who, remembering the character of God. So they're not living in the continual story, they're living into a new story. What are they doing? They are retraining their attention and reframing their attention and giving holy attention to the very thing that God calls and invites us into. They're remembering, they're reminding that the story that we're actually living is a smaller story, and there's a bigger story that God invites us into, the deeper story. The story where God had led us across various pathways and brought us to where we are together. Because friends, what you rehearse over and over again gets reinforced. And I want you to think about the things that you're rehearsing over and over again. Those get reinforced and embedded deeper into your body, into your nervous system, into your life. And so if we rehearse fear over and over and over again, fear becomes the driving narrative of a life. Or if you rehearse scarcity long enough, you start to believe that there never will be enough, and we're always in lack. And that's a smaller story. Or what about the wounds? When you live deep inside the wound, instead of addressing the wound, and the wound becomes part of your identity, that starts to affect relationships. And one of my teachers said something to me years ago, where he says, whatever isn't transformed in us will be transmitted. And if we don't experience the transformation that God gives us, it ends up getting transmitted. And here's the deal. So much of that gets transmitted to the people who are closest to us, the ones who are in closest proximity, that we love and are in close relationship with. So the important work of getting in tune with the deep groove and getting in tune with the deeper story is so important, so that those things become transformed and not transmitted. Now, I don't want to pretend that healing is easy or that we just do it on the surface. Healing is not about denying the things that have happened. It's about living into those things, even at a deeper level. And what I noticed in the prayer is there's no denial going on here. There's no denial. It's a refusal to not admit the ways in which we messed up or participated even in some of our own dysfunction. They tell the truth about their rebellion. They tell the truth about their past. They tell the truth about all the ways in which they had been unfaithful to the one who had always been faithful, but they don't let their failure become the final narrator of their life. And this is why this story is so important, and this prayer is so important for us to step into communally. They rehearse the faithfulness of God over and over again. And again, it's creating new grooves and stepping into a better song. And they remind themselves, God showed up at the Red Sea. God showed up at the great and terrible wilderness. God showed up in great uncertainty. God gave us bread when we were hungry. God showed up over and over and over again, rehearsing and reinforcing. It's like God is always making the first move. He moves towards us and invites us to move towards him. It's a back and forth rehearsing, and slowly the needle gets lifted out of the deep groove and we begin to remember who we are. And our group identity begins to experience deep healing, and they sing and they pray and they gaze and they fix their eyes on the very character of God. And then comes move two. And move two is what I call the unedited reckoning. It's verses 16, 17, and 26 through 30. And this unedited reckoning is part of the posture of fully embodying this move. And this is the prayers that we tend to like to edit out, but there's no edit happening here. They step fully into the story. They don't just look at the highlight reel. They look at the whole story and they step fully into it, and they remember the golden calf, which is interesting because they weren't there when the people chose to worship an inanimate object over the Lord God, but they were remembering that they're part of a bigger story and part of a people, and it's not just about where they're situated in history. They admit that they had become stubborn and stiff-necked, and the beautiful thing that they admit is they had become arrogant. They admit their arrogance. In other words, they got comfortable, and when they got comfortable, they began to forget. And when we forget, we tend to drift. We go into a drift, and then we drift off into different stories. But what I love about this is they step into a corporate confession and they say it out loud together. There's a communal prayer, a communal repentance, a communal effort to come before the living God with dusty fabrics, and none of the failure is edited out. It's all put in there. And they admit it, and they own it, and they name it, and they move through it. And they don't let it identify who they are becoming, but they stay rooted in the story. And if we're honest, friends, if we're honest, every church, every community has stories that we're rehearsing over and over again that need to have a serious look. Part of what I got to do just a few years ago in 2018, I was invited to be an interim pastor at a church in Northern California, Hillside Covenant Church. And Hillside Covenant Church had a long tenured history, a 50-plus year history of blessing the city. They were situated on a hill. They were in a prominent community. There were lots of golden calves hidden in the shadows of the church. And what I got to do was to go in as the interim pastor and start addressing some of the toxicity. It's always a fun job. And I was either loved or hated, because certain people were like, well, it's about time that we start looking at these things. And other people were like, let's not talk about the skeletons that are hidden in the back shadows or in the back windows or the back doors of this church. And we began addressing them. And it was hard work, and there was grief, and there was honesty, and there was corporate confession, and there was this invitation to take a hard look, and it was exhausting work, but it was such meaningful work. In fact, I had groups of people who were beginning to sign petitions to have me removed. That's how it got. There was these petitions that were brought to my attention of people like, how do we get this guy out of here? Because we don't want to look at these hard things. So yeah, I was both loved and hated, but the work was so necessary, and it was what certain people wanted to do to help this thing move towards liberation. That's the work that I got to do as an interim, and I loved it because it brought about change and healing. What about our beloved Bel Air Church? 70-year history. I'm fairly new. I come in with fresh eyes and wondering, I can't give you the full picture of what I see in this beloved community, but I wonder, it does make me curious, I wonder if we can admit to ourselves that comfort has become more important than calling. And I wonder if we can admit to ourselves that keeping people happy has mattered more than helping people wake up. I wonder if we can admit that there have been seasons where we have maybe got it wrong that a room full of people equates to a faithful people. And I hear these stories throughout our history. And what I've learned about people is people would soon rather die than change. Change is the only constant. It's always coming. Change doesn't ask us, do you want to change? Change changes by its very nature. And people resist that. But here's the beauty of this prayer. This is not a prayer of humiliation. This is a prayer of liberation. And I think that's the good news, is that the prayer, with all of the unedited reckoning, revealing the character of God, going back to remember forward, there's an honestness in the prayer, a brutal honesty that reckons with all of it, which leads to movement 3, which is what I call the butt of mercy. And the butt of mercy we see in verse 17 and 27 through 31. The story never ends with forgetting. The story always, at different times, ends in a certain refrain, and it appears like this: but you are a forgiving God, a gracious God, a compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in love. That little word "but" carries this enormous theological weight. The butt of mercy. We rebelled, but you. We forgot, but you. We wandered, but you. We failed, but you. The defining reality of the story is not about the inconsistency and the unfaithfulness of people. The defining reality of the story is about God's faithfulness, the unending faithfulness of God. And for those of us who have confessed Jesus as Lord and have chosen to follow Jesus, we see Jesus embedded in the story, because Nehemiah 9 in the big story is pointing us to Jesus. Nehemiah 9 is pointing to a God who longs to move towards people and make the first move. It points us to a God who made a decision to take on flesh and move in among us, not just to shout his covenant from a distance, but to move towards people and become like us. And this God shows up as Jesus takes on flesh, moves into the streets with us, and enters into our wandering, enters into our unfaithfulness, enters into our exile and our suffering and all the ways that we've misstepped. And Jesus becomes the faithful one that Israel could never be. And he stays in the story. And Jesus remembers the Father completely all the way through. And he remembers the story, and he goes back into the story so that he can continue to lead forward. And even on the night before Jesus was to die on the cross, he invites us into a meal of remembrance. And he says, remember this moment. And at the very center of the Christian life is this practice of remembering. It's why it's so essential to our transformation of people, returning to the story over and over again. And realizing that we're not being chased by our failures, we're actually being pursued and chased by the fierce grip of grace. That's the invitation, which leads to the hinge and where we started. In view of all of this, we are making a binding agreement. And this is what I call the therefore moment. Remembering is not the destination. Remembering is just the doorway into freedom. The people don't just feel emotional. They don't just become nostalgic about the past. Something awakens in them. They stop reacting, they stop drifting, and they start paying holy attention to the bigger story. And not by inventing a new brand or a new identity, but by going back into the story that they've actually been living in all along. And that's the waking up, that's the realization. So we land with this full body act. So moving through all of this, now we see a fully embodied practice. And this is why the people of God have always practiced rhythms of remembering. We gather around tables as God people. We sing songs every time we gather. We confess sin out loud. We read ancient texts in the midst of modern chaos. We root ourselves back into the story. We practice Sabbath in a culture that is perpetually accelerating forward. Why? Because forgetting happens naturally. It happens to all of us. And if you've forgotten the story this week, I invite you to consider, as we gather in these places, this school where we learn and we grow to realize the person in front of me, the person behind me and next to me is bearing witness to a bigger story. It's why we come together, so that we can remember the story. And so when I look across the room at my brothers and my sisters, I'm like, that person is bearing witness. They're bearing witness to a better story, a bigger story, pointing us to Jesus, the faithful one. And the story has rung true for people throughout history. And every time I forget, I re-inhabit myself into the bigger story. And it's not just my story. This is God's story. This is a big story of God that we get to step into. In view of all of this, in view of the whole way, in view of God's mercy, in view of all the ways that God has not abandoned us, in view of our 70-year history as a church, a Bel Air church, we're still here. In view of all of it, what is this binding agreement that we're willing to make? What is it that's inviting us forward? What would it stop, or what would it start to look like if we stopped giving our undivided attention and rehearsing all the ways that life has failed us, but that God didn't show up, and started rehearsing the ways in which he had blessed us? Because you always reinforce what you rehearse. So keep that in mind as we begin rebuilding around the presence of God. The walls that God invited the people to rebuild were not the walls that were holding them together. They were just the scaffolding. The walls that were holding them together were actually the big story of God. And that's what we get to do. So I leave you with that, friends. Invite yourself into the big story, and may God meet you, may he bless you and keep you. Grace and peace be with you.
Hi, my name's Jasmine, and I'm one of the worship leaders here at Bel Air Church. Each Sunday, I have the joy of leading our congregation in musical worship, not just here in our sanctuary, but also with our kids and our youth to build a strong foundation of worship in our younger generation. If you've been joining us online, I'd love to direct your attention to our YouTube page, where you can view tons of worship recordings and worship with us from home. I'd also love to mention that if you've been impacted by our broadcast or the ministry of Bel Air Church, I invite you to partner with us financially by donating any amount so we can continue the work of this church with our kids and more. Visit belair.org/give today. And if you're local to Los Angeles, we invite you to visit us on our campus and join us for one of our two services, 9 a.m. for our traditional service or 11 a.m. Visit belair.org for more information. We can't wait to see you. God bless.